So I wanted to do a video coming from a cursory state talking about the fundamentals of Boxcutter. So if we press N, we can bring up the N panel, and N will allow us to display our help. I'll collapse all these other subpanels for we won't be needing them. And for the sake of this, we'll be using the Simple Pi, which is under the behavior sprocket under display. Simple Pi, pressing that will allow me to press D to change my cut operation on the fly. However, for this, we'll be starting out in box. So the first thing I want to talk about is snap with using dots. But before that, let's talk about some fundamentals. So whenever you click and drag on the surface, you're orienting your draw to that surface. If you begin clicking and dragging off of the surface, you're going to perform what's called a view aligned cut. And so you see that there's definitely a difference between drawing on the surface and drawing on the view. And this also extends into many of the other modes that I'll be talking about, but this is one of the fundamentals of Boxcutter that's important to understand, is that if you do something while over a surface, you'll get a much different result than when you do it starting off of the surface. And this is us attempting to fill in the holes as to what should Boxcutter do in certain cases. For example, another case is if you have a shape deselected and you attempt to perform a cut, you won't perform a cut. Instead, you'll perform a make operation. So once you're aware of this, you can actually use make to your advantage by just quickly being able to draw things and extrude them on the fly. But to the uninitiated, it would possibly seem confusing to wonder why you're not able to perform a cut and instead are continuously making objects. And that is because the object isn't selected. What else would it do if you have nothing selected? We've talked about some possibilities of replacing drawing with nothing selected to replace with just a selection box. So we may be coming back down the road with some alternatives for that. However, I'm a big fan of having nothing drawing make, and whenever you're working, you're able to just draw by drawing off of the mesh. In this case, instead of double clicking in order to complete the operation, I'm just drawing and pressing escape. Notice that every time I start drawing off of the mesh, I'm drawing basically a view aligned cut. In the event that I want to draw over the mesh, you see that it automatically is orienting itself to surface. But if I click on this icon for align to view, that means that even when I draw over the surface, I'm still drawing in a view aligned state. So in the event that you ever need to override it, there's a toggle in the top bar for that very reason. And so we'll just keep doing a little drawing, aligning to view at this time. And with that, hopefully you get the idea. But any time that you need to toggle it back off, you're able to just in the top bar. Also notice that when I'm drawing in view, that the top bar shows red in view, letting you know that you're drawing in a context in which your view was overridden, so it's showing as an alert color of red to let you know that that is what's going on. So let's delete this cube, bring in another cube, and start talking about snapping. So before even getting to dots, which is where I was about to go at the beginning, let's just talk about snapping in general. So if we draw a box and we press tab, when we press R, there's a snap to 15 that's being set up here. In fact, we can actually look at that underneath the snap options. Rotate angle is currently set to 15, which in the event that you ever need to override it, you could always just press shift and you can override that rotation to be something fine or release it to go back to snapping at 15-degree increments. We can even go in and raise this to something like 90, and now we're able to quickly turn this shape 90, which is something that I'm wanting to map to alt scroll on the mouse someday. However, at this time, you can just go in and adjust your rotation angle, and that will adjust the rotation in most operations. So if we press D and we jump over to say N-gon and we begin drawing, we see that we're not actually adhering to that rotation angle that we're talking about. And that's because that rotation angle is to do with only rotation. That means we have to press R, and we see that we're now rotating this, I believe, 30 degrees each time. However, we can raise this to 90 and really just slap this thing from side to side without having to deal with all the degrees in between. We'll just click to laser cut this through, and we see that because we're in N-gon, we now have N-gon angle, which also defaults to 15. We can set this to something like 30, which means that whenever we draw our N-gon, we're now using 30-degree changes in between. You might notice that dot occasionally popping up. That dot is part of a suggestive snap system, which currently is being utilized for something called last point. One of our goals with Boxcutter in one of our previous updates was to be able to get the first point to align to the last point, and that culminated in a feature called last point. So you'll see that dot showing up, and just hovering over it will allow you to align your first point to your last point. So now that we've drawn the shape, we can press G, rotate it, and we see that we're rotating on 90 every time we press R and move the mouse. We're rotating at 90. Let's just click and apply this. The higher that the Ngon snap angle is set to, the more rigid I feel the Ngon becomes. So I personally like to keep it at 15 just because it gives me a little bit more flexibility with getting the most out of it for general operations that I want that have a sort of uniformity to it with angles, but also something that's flexible enough that I can experiment and double or half the idea of 30 to get something even more interesting. So here I am using that suggestive snap. This option will always be there. There's no option to turn it off, and really there's no reason to, because it's simply always out of the way. It's something you would have to go out of your way in order to reach out for. So basically we've talked about Ngon angle and rotation angle in the context of working. So now we can begin talking about orientation. So we talked about how basically if you begin drawing off of the mesh, you're utilizing view, and if you're drawing with your cursor on the surface, you're actually using surface orientation. Let's delete this shape and let's Shift A, bring in another cube, and I'm going to go in edit mode and I'm going to select this point, and we'll press J to put an edge in between them. And now let's begin drawing our shape. We want to make sure that we're in local for this, but basically whenever you first install Boxcutter, you're in the orientation method of local, and this means that the underlying geometry doesn't have any effect on what is happening with your orientation. So that means that as I continue to draw these shapes, we see that they're being situated in accordance with local X, let's call it. So in the event that you actually want to orient your cut to the underlying geometry like this particular edge, that's where orientation methods come in. By expanding the orientation area, we can see that we're currently in object for alignment, but we're also able to change our orient method to something like nearest edge. And nearest edge will make it where basically your cut will be oriented to the nearest edge, like you're seeing me do in this case, which can give you a rather unique experience. This was one of the bigger additions to Boxcutter because it gives so much control for keeping your cuts in order. So we see that this cut didn't actually work out, and this is because if we zoom in, our cut actually oriented to this particular edge. So by drawing it here, I'm able to orient my cut to this edge and thus keep the orientation of this local area. An important rule of Booleans to keep in mind is that as you're cutting into things, geometry will be generated automatically by Blender, and this geometry has the capability of overriding your orientation. And sometimes being unaware of this can cause some issues with your orientation, like as I'm cutting, we see that my orientation is just being organized to these random edges that are appearing to connect to geometry. If we press Ctrl Z and remove this, we can bring this back to something more sane, and we could talk about orientation in action. So now that we have this shape, looking at it head on from this 45-degree angle, we can draw a shape organized to fit this particular edge that we were drawing in the vicinity of, and press B in order to bevel. We'll press spacebar to apply, and from here press D and switch to circle. In the middle of circle, we'll press J in order to make this a join operation and extrude this out. And it looks like we went out just a little bit too much, so I Everscroll recalled it and then moved it over a little bit. But we see that, you know, thanks to orient method, we were able to create something in this particular angle area without having to do a whole lot of thinking or pressing R and pondering how we were going to rotate it. Another thing too is that using the power of HardOps, we could press Alt X, and by pressing X you can reset the mirror to its defaults, and by pressing V you can actually use the mirror in accordance with view. So I'm just going to click on the X, and we see that we've now mirrored to the other side. And what this means is that when I'm working, I can now cut in a mirrored fashion adjacent to the opposite side of where I'm working with this particular angle. An interesting thing about Boxcutter too is the ability to do extractions. So we can actually just draw a box over this whole area, press Y to convert it into an extraction. We've basically extracted this. And even though we've extracted this at an angle, we have systems in place that will actually organize it to be a straight object once again, allowing you to draw it in a straight orientation. So here I am basically repeating that area that we had before, and we're just going to repeat it in this particular corner. In fact, I'm going to go to the top and let's lower our rotation amount to maybe 45, and something like that will do. You just bring it to the edge, pressing G, and let's just press spacebar to apply. And we've now repeated that shape that we took on that other shape that didn't work out, and we're now repeating it to this particular area. So if we press X, we can reset the mirror, and we'll just mirror there and mirror to the other side, just holding shift to keep it live for a moment while clicking the first mirror handle. Let's press Alt V and turn off wireframe. And before we continue, let's just bevel this edge just so we have a nicer look to it. And let's now begin talking about orienting on the surface. So if I wanted to begin detailing this particular quadrant, we see that things are going to start getting a little random. Even if we have nearest edge, we could start working very close to this and then bringing it out and continuing to make adjustments. But really, this is where grid comes in for me. So if we activate grid, we see that we're able to activate grid with control. And normally grid is adherent to basically the object, like you see here. And then if you hold control while you're off the mesh, it will actually orient itself to view, which is a completely different orientation mode as discussed previously. So the same rules that play with meshes also play with the orientation systems like grid. So if you're starting a grid off the mesh and you bring it over here and you begin cutting, you can bet your bottom dollar that it's going to be a view aligned cut. However, one of the things I requested previous was that whenever we're working in this sort of orientation method that's being overridden, that we would basically turn the text red in the top bar to let users be more aware. So just looking at the top bar lets you know that your view is being overridden from your settings, and we hope to explore and expand on that more as time goes on. So because we're already in the orientation method of nearest edge, that means when we press control, we're able to grab this edge vector as our orientation area. And we'll just scroll the wheel down to shrink our grid a little bit, and we'll draw a shape encompassing this, bring it down, press B, roll the wheel to simplify it, press T to give it some thickness, hit spacebar, and we're now able to complete the operation. So because nearest edge is this edge, I don't even need the grid to orient to this. We can just go in and just start cutting wedges. I always like to follow up these panel cuts with wedges just to give it a little extra oomph. Another thing too is, let's say we wanted to mirror our cutter to the other side. I'm going to press Q, use Everscroll to recall this, and we'll press Alt X, and we'll press D, change our pivot point to be cursor, and then press D and change our orientation to be view. And basically by mirroring this to the other side in accordance with the view, we're able to have kind of a localized symmetry going. If we wanted, we could actually mirror it on the object level and deal with it, but we'll just keep it simple for now. Another one of my favorite features in Boxcutter, completely irrelated to this, is talking about slice and the capabilities of pressing Alt X in order to activate something called recut, which will basically slice back a version of the mesh that's unmodified by the other modifiers. So by clicking and applying that, we now have this new circle. And let's turn off grid for just a moment. Whenever we hold control and we hover over the surface, we have dots appearing. Right now, dots are actually appearing off, apparently due to some bug that we're still in the process of addressing. But in order to resolve this at this time, we have found that by going into preferences and enabling and disabling Boxcutter, we're able to get past whatever preference related issue actually causes that to happen. So now when we hover over this and we press control, we actually see dots the way that they're supposed to be. So it's letting you know that if you run into issues where your dots are off, it could be related to old preferences, and that could cause you some problems down the road. So dots is intended to be a bit of a jump off point. For example, if I had a box, I could start here and I could just hold control, begin drawing my box, press Alt, extrude it in, and that would basically be me using dots as a jump off point. However, the center dot of face is the one that we're after, and the shape that we want to put in the middle of it is a circle. So the thing about using dots is that the moment you cut a surface, the dots being generated are different because it's a different surface. You've modified the surface with Booleans, and this is where dots begin to diverge. We have multiple systems for dots. Right now you're looking at what's called the default, what we call dynamic dots. However, there's a secondary system of static dots, which is basically our classic dots, but expanded in a slightly different path. And this system has a whole slew of additional features that are not able to be done in the dynamic system. Dynamic is poised for a different journey, but static remains because there's some ideas that we want to explore, and I just don't want to separate from it just yet. So by activating static dots, one of my favorite features with it is being able to bring up dots and just pressing tab to pause them. So now I'm able to rotate my object. Hell, I could select this object and begin performing cuts on it, and these dots remain unaffected. Like, static dots are really crazy. In fact, to get rid of them, we just press escape and you can clear them off the screen. But just to show that static dots are capable of being very static if you lock them in place. So another thing about static dots that's interesting is that Control Shift will allow you to subdivide. And so right now we're dealing with an n-gon circle, so we're not able to subdivide the faces in the center, but we are able to subdivide the edges. Of course, be careful to avoid getting too many points in which it will just become ineffective. So let's just press D, and with our pause points, let's just show a benefit of why point pausing is a good thing. So we'll just draw this shape, and then we'll draw another shape and bring that one in. And we can jump to box, which the thing about box is whenever you're using it with radial array, it actually plays off of that center point. So by having a static dot center point as your origin, and you draw from there, you're able to repeatedly use radial array without any sort of issue. So another way to show it in action is we draw a box, extrude it out, press VV, and we're now dealing with this particular box as an accent being added to the previous radial array. So if we press escape to get rid of that, we see that we're able to add our desired detail. And another thing we may also want to do is press Q, ever scroll, bring this piece back, and let's select this empty that's on the inside along with this piece, and we'll just take them both in a local. So first we want to select this, then the empty, Alt X, modifier, and we can come back out and see that we are not oriented correctly. Let's try that again. Let's select this piece, let's just press Alt X, and we'll just press V and just mirror it from view, make our lives easier. And we'll do the same thing with this, selecting this piece, pressing Alt X, we'll press A to add a new modifier, and we'll just mirror it from view as well, just so we have a little bit of symmetry going all the way around with our circular shape. However, we see that it didn't appear on some sides, and usually when that happens, that's where you want to go in and inspect your modifier order. So in this case, what we did was we performed all these Booleans and then we did a double mirror. If we reverse the order of these two mirror modifiers, we see that that actually rectifies the issue. So sometimes it can be as simple as that, but mirroring can definitely get a little bit confusing. In Boxcutter, we keep it a little bit more simple. In the context of this video, we'll talk about it just briefly. So actually, if we press 1 with mirror, we're going to be mirroring to the other side. And if we press 2, we'll be mirroring to the y-axis, and pressing 3 will mirror to the z. When it comes to dealing with localized mirroring, HardOps is just way more light years ahead when it comes to that. So let's make sure our orientation method is set up to nearest edge, and we're just going to draw a box right here. Press B, bevel it, round it out, hold Shift to keep it live. We'll look at it from the same angle we've been working on, pressing Alt X, and we'll just mirror that over into a new modifier. But just like that, hopefully you have a better idea of kind of where we're coming from when it comes to using orientation and grid, and how you can get some additional benefits out of the static dot system. Another thing about dots is, you know, with dynamic, they have the ability to have custom fade out times. So right now we see that the fade out time is rather intense at just 100. However, let's change this to something like 50 and 3800. So now when we press Control and release, we see that they actually take a longer time to fade out. Currently, you're not able to orient over dots and still orient yourself and jump off of them while they're fading out, but it was definitely something on the request list that I'll be talking about at another time, hopefully, where maybe we can actually play off a fade and let ourselves just basically paint dots and jump off of them in their fade times until we no longer need them, kind of like a timed operation sort of thing. So with this shape, I actually fell back to traditional rotation, where basically I drew it, it came out like that. I just rotated it sideways and then beveled it and pressed Shift T in order to taper. Press N to bring out the end panel. For some reason, I don't never need the end panel, of course, but all the hotkeys are listed here. So we'll just jump off of this point, and we see that it was also disastrous. So we'll just press R to bring it in. When we grab this dot, we'll just move it slightly, press B to bevel, and we're able to cut this point precisely in the center. So let's actually undo these last two cuts and switch over to static dots. Once the dots fade out, we'll just pause these dots and then turn on these last two modifiers, and we're just going to use this dot to jump off. And another thing to talk about is whenever you're drawing, utilizing corner draw, you could also press period in order to switch over to center draw, which can also be pre-configured in your draw settings. And we're just going to draw a box all around this, press Y, and we've now performed an extraction. So this means that if we press escape and get rid of those dots, we can just bring in another cube, and let's just select this dot, and we are able to repeat basically the entirety of what we just did, even down to the circle where we clipped it short. I'm going to put a weighted normal just to fix the shading a little bit, but I can even press Alt X on this and X again to reset and mirror this just like before, this time going down on the Z. But just like that, it's that easy to draw in a oriented fashion and repeat it in various areas throughout your shape.